Let me get started. And today we are going to talk about the cloud. How many of you guys are using the cloud here? Anyone? Yeah, a few folks. Well, fantastic. Well, many of you probably don't know me, so I wanted to maybe say a few words about where I come from and what is my perspective. I was involved in open source since late 90s, and a lot of my open source education came in MySQL AB, right? That's a company who created MySQL before Oracle, before Sun, and I was the founder and until recently CEO of Percona, the company which helps you to run open source databases better. And through all those years, I also was very much involved in their advocating open source, right? And I would say that like a real open source, right? Now that comes to a couple of perspectives. One thing I would say is what I do believe, everything being equal, open source is a better choice for the customer and also for ecosystem at large. And I also believe from an organizational standpoint, it is, if you are focused on the long-term results, it is better to invest your resources in making open source better working for you, right, than just invest in proprietary software, right, then creates value for some other company, right, and doesn't really leave much residual to you, right? Like, for example, if you are, buying Oracle, well, guess what, right? They're releasing the next version, you have to kind of, buy it again, right, to continue paying for support, right, and that investment just go to that vendor, while if you build some open source features, guess what? Now you can use them in perpetuity, right, without having that ongoing expense. Now we are talking about the cloud, right, and about serfdom, right? I specifically wanted to use this word, right, as you can look up at Wikipedia. We can define what that is. Kind of different from slavery, but it is about environment, right, in which situation is created by elite, if you will, right, where you lose some of your freedoms, right? And I think that is very easy situation to get into if you adopt the cloud in a wrong way. I think right now we can have this interesting dynamics where we can have sort of like two different paths, right, which exist for us right now, right, and the people are sort of evaluating, right? And I think it's very interesting for me to see what will be prevailing over long term, right? Now, comparison so I can make are those, right? This is logo of Vodafone and Apple, right? What I think is interesting if you think about the mobile networks or internet providers, right? We can see while there have been some attempts to differentiate things, right? In the end, they accepted their role as commodity infrastructure provider, right? Hey, you know what? Wherever your internet provider is or cell phone provider is, well, at large extent, you don't really care. Yes, quality may be a little bit easier or a little bit better or worse, right? But changing your provider is not that big of a deal. Now, if you look at Apple, they have created an ecosystem which is completely controlled, right? There's like a lot of discussion right now. Well, is that fair? What if you want to sell something on Apple platform, you have to pay what is like a 30%, right, or whatever racket kind of amounts, right, in that ecosystem, right, in this case. So we do have, if you look from a business standpoint, different approaches have been successful in a marketplace. How does that apply to the open source? Well, this is from a presentation from Bruce Momjan, who is from PostgreSQL ecosystem, right, which I think is very good, showing how things happen with open source and proprietary software. And the main thing you need to look in this case is what the open source software often starts later down the road compared to the proprietary software. And often it actually may take a longer time to reach the same level of performance compared to a proprietary software. In many cases, this kind of messy, democratic, open source development process, right, it takes longer time compared to if you just lead this small focus engineering team, right, building proprietary software with a lot of funding. Well, you often can make it faster, right? Let me provide some examples here. Now, anybody here runs Solaris, HPUX, AX in the past? No? Well, when I was getting involved in an open source, right, a lot of my friends were involved with the real operating systems, right? And they were like, what? You are messing with Linux? That is a joke. That is like 32-bit operating system. It's not good with SMPs. Well, at that time, you couldn't even create file more than 2 GB in size on Linux. Like seriously, right? That was a joke. But now, 20 plus years later, well, we can see what Linux pretty much has a dominance as an open source, well, not just open source, but in general, infrastructure operating system, right? What I see in this, if you draw comparables, I think this one is also relevant. I remember in early 2000s, the same friends of mine often would be developing on Microsoft ASP.NET, right, or whatever it was called at that time, stack, right? They had a very nice and polished graphical user interface with after completion and all that stuff, right? And us, we were using VI, you know, to code in Perl, PHP, or whatever your choice is, right? Or maybe if you're from another camp, you would be using Emacs, but it was like a very different experience. Guess what? If you think about right now, all the ecosystem about open source development is absolutely fantastic, right? It just took a while to get there. And I think we're in a similar situation with cloud right now, when we have a very sexy, well-integrated, easy-to-use proprietary cloud solutions, right, where open source just didn't come up yet. Now, one question you have or approach you may have is, well, the open source in the cloud, we do have those vendors make open source technologies easier to use for everyone. Isn't that wonderful? Well, I think in many cases we are actually using this old strategy, which is called embrace, extend, and extinguish. Right? Somebody heard that before? Often we see their open source technologies taken to the cloud, where either are extended, maybe from usability standpoint, or maybe custom features. Like in my database space, Amazon Aurora, right, which is only available in the cloud, which is such an extension, right? And as you push your companies to your customers to utilize those very advanced features, well, guess what, right? You are essentially creating the lock-in of that proprietary software. But I think a big frontier where a lot of innovation needs to happen with open source is this usability and ease of use, right? That is, I think, their main challenge right now. There is a lot of open source which is very powerful, but that is actually not chosen in particular cases because it's not as easy to use. Why is that important? And how is that different compared to, let's say, open source in the late 90s, open 2000s? Well, one is software explosion, right? There is so much software everywhere those days, right? You think about like an apps, and guess what? Somebody, and also data explosion, right, to supplement that. Now, guess what? Somebody has to write this whole software. And there, if you look at the 90s, right, there was a relatively small group of those, let's say, early adopters of computers, right, often have like computer science background, right, very passionate about technology, right. Right now, it is changing. There are a lot of people who do not have that depth, right, that level of skills, right, which are right in the software, right. In many cases, you may become their JavaScript front-end software engineer after maybe a couple of weeks courses or something like that, right? And we need those people to be successful, right? I'm not kind of trying to badmouth those folks in any way, right? But that also means the software needs to be much easier. The challenge as it connects to the cloud is also this. We have a lot of people coming in when they have sort of like an open source skills, but it's actually only cloud specific skills. Like somebody may tell, like, hey, I know Postgres, but that means they can use those kind of AWS interface to deploy RDS. They don't have that skill in a Postgres. Another thing what I see is what the cloud providers are very much pushing towards using the most proprietary services. If you think about, for example, Amazon training or well-architected infrastructure, right, or whatever it is, it's not going to be about, well, guys, you should deploy EC2s, right, and run a database on them, right, or run it on Kubernetes. No, it's going to be, you should fully embrace Aurora, DynamoDB, Redshift, and so on and so forth, which is, guess what? They are much more expensive than that kind of foundational compute infrastructure they run on, and with every year, that price difference becomes larger. What we also see in this case is this trend of a venture-funded open source versus, coming from community, right? And what has happened in many cases, those folks, to protect themselves from unfair competition of a cloud, has been changing license to non-open source, right? Like you think about MongoDB, Elastic, Redis, bunch of others, right? And what that creates, I think, is this kind of culture of fear in the open source, because they're saying, like, what is the point to go and embrace open source? They're going to change the license in the end, they screw us in the end anyway, so we can just as well use the proprietary solution in the cloud, right? That is, of course, very different from how community the open source, right, or community foundation, wherever, which have been taken the cloud very differently. And I see they really embrace the cloud as a channel, something to grow adoption in this case, because, well, that makes their software easier to use, right? And often cloud folks hire engineers to make that software better. Think about the open source versus MongoDB, right, which changed the license. In PostgreSQL space, which is a community-driven database, we see the top dogs are changing. Previously, you would have like an enterprise DB, the biggest company in the PostgreSQL ecosystem. Well, guess what? Now, Amazon's, Microsoft, Google are probably making more money on Postgres. I don't know, but I would guess. But they are also increasingly employing more and more engineers to work on the core Postgres. So PostgreSQL ecosystems stays healthy. We also saw in their last few years, I think it's a decade, a lot of growth at any cost, right? Money was cheap for a lot of venture-funded startups having, nothing to do with open source, right? And in this case, if you want to grow as fast as possible, then saying, hey, you know what, I will take an easy road, right? We'll pay the cloud vendors, right? Instead of embracing open source, which will require to me put to some, elbow grease, right? To hire some additional people, which is hard, and so on and so forth, which was not really happening. Additionally, the cloud vendors really used this thing, right? They learned from someone, right? I think what the first dose of heroin for free is good for business, right? There is a free tiers on all the cloud vendors. A lot of the cloud vendors also have been kind of doing like a generous startup grants, right? Which would be enough for you to fully get hooked, right? On the proprietary elements on the cloud and not go anywhere. Though, I think things are changing, right? I think this was very interesting to look at this cost of the cloud paradox, right, from A16Z, when they're saying, well, you know what? Actually, cloud is quite expensive, right? If you care about your margins, which you should if eventually you want to be profitable company, not just focus on the growth, right? Then for many data-intensive company, cloud costs are huge, right? In this case, we also have seen this article recently, which got a lot of resonance about 37C signals. Rather small but very influential companies spoke about why they're leaving the cloud, right? And pretty much this is, freaking super expensive, right? And then if you read the thread, you will see, well, actually, if you compare that to what we can build ourselves, right, that is absolutely huge, huge difference, right? And I think that is the secret the cloud vendors often don't want you to know, right? They want that to be seen like, well, clouds is a cost-effective thing, right, which reduces your total cost of ownership and yada, yada, yada. Well, may not be always the case. I think another trend which is quite interesting is GitOps, right, or other declarative version infrastructure as a code approach, because in many cases that is something there the open source approaches, like maybe Terraform or Kubernetes integrations work often better than your GUI and kind of CLI APIs clouds provide, right? At least if you embrace this approach, the usability of that proprietary cloud is not that much better. We also see this interesting trend about hybrid cloud being embraced. And guess what? When you have a hybrid cloud, you have something on-prem, maybe multiple cloud vendors, well, then you have to be very careful in terms of what proprietary solutions which only exist for a given cloud vendors you can use. And I think this is very interesting what we can see what for larger enterprises, right? We can see what it's like more than 70% would use hybrid cloud or multi-cloud, right, approaches. Quite big. I also see what open source is actually catching up again, I think, in this ecosystem for now, right? If you look at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and what they are doing, it is really phenomenal. There are so many projects for everything out there, and I will just blow up a little bit of this logo, this small thumbnail I have out there, but you probably still cannot see every logo out there, and that is really intentional, right? Like if the point here is what there's actually kind of so much stuff. Sometimes maybe like too much stuff. You say, well, what exactly should I use, right, for this? Hey, but that is also, I think, an open source way. We can see what the many projects will innovate concurrently to figure out what is the best approaches, right? And then, well, guess what? Some of them will merge, some of them will die off, right? And there's some consolidation is going to happen. What that allows us, I think, is really to give a cloud its intended choice. And it's not just me saying it's intended, that is actually the presentation, or a slide, right, from Amazon presentation from, probably a decade and a half ago, when they're explaining cloud to people. Saying, well, cloud is like electricity. It doesn't make sense of you to, run your own generator at home, right? You can get electricity from utility, right, and so on and so forth. Well, the difference, of course, is what electricity is a standardized utility. You can change your vendors and still keep your, TV, your microwave, right, to your fridge. And I think it totally makes sense to use the cloud this way. What doesn't make sense is to get your TV, microwave, right, or washing machine, which only works with that particular electricity provider, right? And I think that is what we often see as a push from a cloud vendors. So anyway, we have like two ways to run the cloud. Right, cloud of freedom and cloud of serfdom, and at this point we can take a vote. Which of you prefer cloud of serfdom is a better idea? That is the way to go. No Amazon, AWS staff members in house. Okay, what about freedom? Cloud of freedom. Okay, look at that. Well, that's good crowd, right? So how do we get there? Well, one thing I think which is a big foundation which happened in this case is Kubernetes API, which has become ubiquitous, available on every cloud. And even though Kubernetes was initially designed for a stateless application, it has been getting better and better every year for even data-intensive applications. Like, I think this CSI, right, container storage interface was, very important in this regard. You can also see communities develop around Kubernetes. Again, we focus on databases, so for us, data on Kubernetes community, right, and actually a lot of people coming together to build databases on Kubernetes, right, and data-intensive applications was very meaningful, and we can see that is actually making a significant impact. Like this is from CNCF annual survey, and you can see what the databases is this second fastest growing type of workloads, right, or to be running on Kubernetes. So people are becoming comfortable right now and moving even the kind of typically the most conservative data applications to Kubernetes. And guess what? Not only we have this happening right now, right? We also have some track record. If you look at the database as a service solutions, public database as a service, which has been launched in, let's say, in the last 3 years or so, a very large number of them are actually using Kubernetes on backend, right? So we can actually have a track record, businesses successfully using the Kubernetes to serve their customers. Here are a couple of more things I would mention in Kubernetes evolutions, which I think is great. One is what we are continuing to get a Kubernetes be able to run everywhere, including this like a FreeKS, K3S distribution, which can run on the edge in a small footprint. Fantastic getting on in that way. We are also working on usability. You can see this is Kubernetes dashboard, which I think is very helpful for people who are more visual and saying, hey, you know what, that's all the API stuff, right? And, YAML and command live is kind of cool, but well, we would like to see something more. We're also seeing a number of application stores which are similar to the cloud marketplaces, right? But open source, which allows people to package applications in like open source and proprietary to make it them deployable directly on Kubernetes, right? Hence, solving, like we're continuing to solve that problem of usability I spoke about. Okay, so what is next, right? How we can move this forward, right, in my opinion? Well, I think first is we need to work on better integrations, right? Because I think that is the name of the game of a software those days. We just expect our software not just to be great on its own island, but we expect software to integrate with everything kind of surrounding that, right? And that is where clouds often provide us a well-integrated components, and the continued work needs to be done. Usability is important thing as well. And the last thing is maybe specific to databases, but well, I'm kind of biased, right? Is a day two operations. I see a lot of work is focused those days on day one, meaning like, oh, I deploy my application. It's kind of wonderful. And you know what? If I need to change it in a certain way, scratch it and deploy again. Well, that works very well for stateless application. But guess what? If you have a database and that's a mission critical database, you want to deploy it once and then it stays up like for years, right? For decades maybe, right? You want to be able to scale it, to update it, to back it up, right? And so on and so forth, right? So, and that day two, right, operations is really majority of a life cycle and majority of complexity for that production mission critical databases. Well, let me finish up with a call for action where I would encourage you to do those three things. Why? Is embrace open source in the cloud, and in a way what you treat cloud as commodity and derive the most value from running open source in it. B, as organization and as well maybe as an individual, invest your time and money in making this better, because that investment pays off over long term and continues paying forever. And number three, spread the word, right? I don't think that's something which is understood very well, right? As I mentioned, I think if you look at from a cloud vendor self-interest, they either want to say, well, it doesn't matter because everybody will try to lock you in anyway in the end, or what there are not feasible open source alternative, right, to our greatest and latest features which exist in the cloud. Well, with that, that's all I had to say, and I'll be happy to take a couple of questions.
Let's give Lisa a round of applause. Thank you. Who out there has a question? I see a couple of hands rising up, I think, yeah.
Mark Ballard, a freelance journalist. Hello. I was wondering if you'd say, please, of the large cloud vendors, suppliers, service providers, name them, IBM, HP, Oracle, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Meta. Probably some I've left out. Can you say which are not the road to serfdom?
Well, look, I mean, if you first, when I speak about the cloud here, right, a lot of that focused first and foremost on the developers, right, application developers, right. So I would refer to clouds like AWS, GCP, Google Compute Platform, Azure, right? Obviously, there's like outside of US, there's like Alibaba Cloud and likes it, right? I think all of them are pretty much following in the same pattern, right? In terms of saying, hey, you know what? We don't want to accept our role of just being commodity provider, right? We really want to push you towards those unique proprietary services which exist only on our cloud, right? So that's pretty much ubiquitous.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, I just want to say thank you. So for someone that's been training with Amazon for like 6 months, it's quite interesting to hear this. So I just wanted to ask, how would you embrace open source in the cloud?
Well, in my idea would be to make sure, right, what you use cloud at the level, right, and that is commodity, right, where you can say you can use cloud X or cloud Y, and you build most of the value or what you care for open source software, right? I think as a second part of presentations, talk about the Kubernetes a lot. I think that is a very good API because that is conceptually allows you to move to manage like a fleet, right, of service, right, of a software rather than focused on just a single box at a time as we do with your Linux, right? You can just say, hey, I use something else, programming on VMs, right, customize things with Chef, right, or some of the automation software. But I think over long term, embracing this Kubernetes approach, right, is a better choice.
Okay, thank you.
One more? Yes.
Thank you. Amazing talk. You really have an amazing example with those electric utilities, right? Mm-hmm. Where I can charge my phone. It doesn't matter what provider of this electric power is. I can kind of like everything works. This is not the same with cloud providers, right? Maybe I'm using even Postgres database, managed one, and there are some maybe specific APIs that are different that locks me in. How we encourage cloud providers to not do that, to actually support the same standard and not lock in users? How to do it?
Well, I think this is interesting, right? And I think a good example in this case, what has been happening with Kubernetes. That's also maybe also the reason why I focus on that, right? If you think about Amazon, right, for a number of time, they tried to push their own container engine of people, right? But then, you know what, because everybody is standardized on a Kubernetes, they reluctantly agreed to do that, right? To support the Kubernetes as well, right? And I think that is what is likely to happen in this case, right? Over a long term, right? There are, I think, like pretty much only kind of two ways, right? One is either you have like a government, right, forcing standardization. But I think the complexity here in this case, like it's not like, well, USB-C, right? Like one simple interface, right, which can, or like, let's say electricity, where say, well, everybody will use the same standards, right? We are speaking about hundreds and thousands of different standards in the cloud. And I think actually trying for government to force them would be problematic, right, and restricting for innovation, right?